Well, good evening. It's been a while. I haven't forgotten the topic of foster care. I've been busy, really busy, but that's no excuse. But it gave me an opportunity to reflect so that the words I say are words that are beneficial to uh, former foster children, foster parents, as well as the social service agency. I feel that as Native American, I really feel that it's time that the social service programs, meaning the state-run programs, foster care, it's time that we begin to look beyond the Indian Child Welfare Act. You know, that was a good act. It benefited. But let me tell you that I feel, and I've seen that many tribes are relying on the Indian Child Welfare Act as a political program entity, a way to voice their opinions. But as far as action, I see many of our tribes losing the responsibility and keeping the responsibility of our children being placed in homes with the state, allowing the state to interpret what they feel is the Indian Child Welfare Act. When that act was generated for Native people to keep Native children in Native homes. Well, I understand there's a lack of Native homes to be licensed as foster homes. But I believe that that's beyond the point. I really feel strongly that we as Native people, we need to get into the social service programs and begin to not only try to enforce. I don't like that word try. We need to enforce the interpretation of how the Indian Child Welfare Act was created by Native people for Native people. And we need to step in and even begin to pressure our tribes and say, these are our children. It's so easy to allow others to take that responsibility when it's really our responsibility. But that's not what I want to address. What I really would like to talk about and what I've really reflected about was my own situation. To kind of go back a little bit, we have to kind of look back at my story. And my story is I was in 7 different foster homes. I was removed at an early age when I was 5 years old and placed in a non Indian home. Well, this non Indian home probably was the best thing that ever happened to me in my life. But unfortunately, it didn't last for whatever reason. I blame the foster parents for giving me up, for letting me go. For many years, I lived with that. You can say a little bit of anger toward them as the foster parents that had me in their home because I was there for a long period of time, years. But what I found out in my older years, as I started getting involved with foster care program and social service agencies, what I discovered was it wasn't their choice. It wasn't their choice to let me go. It was another state decision for whatever reason. I'm not sure. I believe, uh, well, I can't say it was for reconciliation because they didn't put me back with my family. Instead, I was placed in another home. The very first home I was in gave me experiences that I myself, or a lot of Native people, for instance, will never experience. Adventures, great things that happened. I learned responsibility. I learned how to do things, how to use my own initiative, how to do many things in life for survival. Most importantly, I learned not to drink, not to follow that path. Although, when I was younger, after leaving their home, the next home I was placed in was a native home. And in that native home, I was allowed at the age of 14, 15, I was allowed to drink. And what I mean by allowed, the foster parents at times slipped a bottle of wine in my room or told me that I could drink outside. And it was a big bottle of Spinata, the cheapest wine you can buy, but it was a large bottle, enough to get you intoxicated. Why they did that, I don't know. I won't ever know why. But I learned to run the streets at that time. I started skipping school. It was a good foster home in the sense that it was native, although they were not in the culture. They didn't know about the inipi or the lodges. They didn't know about ceremonies, but it was native. And I related to that aspect of it. But it damaged me as well, in the sense that it became a money making home. It wasn't a group home. It was, in the sense that to be a group home, you have to qualify and go through different stipulations, different regulations. Uh, so they stayed under the radar of being a group home and continued to be a foster home. Well, in their home, I experienced drug abuse because I got involved with drugs, all the way from smoking pot all the way up to shooting speed, and I tried heroin once, but that didn't work for me. I didn't like that. It scared me, in fact. Um, but it was a very loose home, and I was removed from that home, and I was placed in another home. But this other home, again, was a non Indian home. And it wasn't a good foster home. They were basically in it for money. The foster children had a separate refrigerator. We had a separate time period where we would have to finish our meals, do our dishes, or whatever it was, so that the natural family could sit down at the dinner table and have their potatoes and steaks, and while we had TV dinners. That was basically our uh, our dinner. It was also a loose family. I don't ever remember being disciplined in that family. um, but all I do remember is the division between us and the foster family. We were foster children. That was the stipulation. The stigma that was placed on us. We were less than their children. We were less than their family. And well, eventually they got shut down because it was all about receiving so much money to become a foster parent. You receive so much money to care for that. foster child. So anyway, that was another home. Well, eventually I ran away and I was picked up and I was placed in another native home. This was a good home, except for it was very loose in the sense that every now and then I would find a joint underneath the door of my bedroom because they were pot smokers, you know. They were good people. I learned to sing native songs. I learned to identify with my native ways because they were somewhat traditional. What I mean by somewhat was they were not totally into tradition, but they were there at the powwows, so they took me to powwows in Portland. They took me to Indian gatherings, and eventually I started to go to the protests because at that time, prior to 73, the big Wounded Knee event, uh, there were small protests going on already. Indian people were already starting to speak out. So I would attend these different protests, and I ended up in jail. Well, it wasn't my doing. It was because I was at the protest. I was a juvenile, but I spent a week in jail, and I was soon released. I went back to the family, but upon appearing in court, the judge gave me an ultimatum because I've already stood before this judge many different times. It was either join the Marine Corps, go to a boys' reform school, McLaren School for Boys, basically a juvenile prison institution, or move to Minnesota with this family. And because they were on the verge of moving out of Portland and moving to Minnesota, where they're originally from. Well, I chose to go with them. And that was my involvement with the American Indian Movement. That was prior to 1968, even before the AIM Patrol, before Wounded Knee, before the Trail of Broken Treaties. So at a very young age, I was already on the streets of Minneapolis. So these are just some of the things that a history of my experience in foster care. The point I want to make is questions that I question within myself, and I've heard others question. When is it viable to remove a child, a native child, from their home? And what are we moving them to? Completely a period of time that a native child can lose his culture, tradition, because going into an Indian home, they know nothing about native people. So there's no sensitivity, cultural sensitivity or knowledge, even to look for a Big Brother program, which I really started to push, was to establish a Big Brother program with Native people so that these children that are placed in these homes would have a big brother or a big sister to spend a day with, just to have some kind of interaction with their Native people. I have to tell you that the home I was in, the very first home I was in, it was a success because I became a success. The only drawback from that home was I had no contact with Native people. My family, they were already within the city, and I often wonder, at that period of time, when we look at history, we look at the replacement, the relocation programs, first on the reservation, and then relocation into the cities, promised jobs, promised education, promised all kinds of benefits. So Native people got placed into the cities, and I feel that my mother and my father, they were one of those recipients to be placed in the city, only to fall on broken promises of jobs and education. So what they had ended up doing was working in the fields, picking strawberries, picking berries, picking apples. The city that I was born in Redmond, Oregon, they were there picking berries. They were following the crops. That's their income. That's how they were surviving. But eventually they started to get so involved in alcohol that it was a blessing that I was removed. But it didn't come without consequences in later years. I want you to think about if you yourself have experienced the foster care system by being a foster child or even being a foster parent. I want you to think about this for a time, to think what that system has done to you, your family, and how could have it become better. Understanding that the period of time that I was placed into foster care, there was no really solid social service programs. So there was no programs to help families or to intervene and try to put families back together. They could have, but they weren't is so advanced. So a few seconds ago I said, let's think about history, about the relocations. Was the foster care system in the 50s and 60s, was that part of all the plan of assimilation Native people into society above the boarding schools? Or was it just a lack of unintentional repercussions? I think are not repercussions, kind of that don't work. That word don't fit. But was it part of an assimilation plan to remove the children from Indian homes, or was it a warranted program? In my case, it was a warranted program, but it came with later results that didn't work for me. And I don't want to just rant on, because I'm thinking about these things very seriously, and I'm thinking about how we can get into these social programs and begin to implement them and begin to implement sensitivity training for these caseworkers, because our children, even to this day, are still being removed. And in some sense, as tribal people, we're allowing that. We're allowing the judicial systems to make decisions for us, because for whatever reason our social service agencies are not recruiting foster homes, or there's a lack of interest in Native people of taking somebody else's child and raising them, which, by the way, is a very cultural thing to do, very traditional, very spiritual thing to do, because children, they belong to the whole tribe. But that's another thing. So I feel like I'm just ranting and going on right now. So I don't know if I'm making any sense, but I'm going to think about this a little more because the way I want to address this is I want to make a difference. And I want us together to begin to look at the results as a surviving foster child, a surviving native child, and I think to expose the damages of taking native children out of their homes. And I understand that it's the native parents' responsibility to not let that happen. We have to start being responsible as parents. But it's a learning process because there was a time in history we were not allowed to be parents. Our children were removed unwarrantedly, placed in boarding schools, placed outside the home, miles and miles, sometimes thousands of miles away from their families. And when that happened, parents had no children to parent. So we began to weaken and lose our parenting skills. So all of these things have to be considered. But if we are going to heal as a nation, as Native people, it's not just about, I've stood on the front lines of the mascot issue. I've stood on the front lines of land rights, of fishing rights, and all of those things. But we cannot allow social issues to go unapproached or looked at. So I hope you please join me, and I hope you can reflect a little bit of what I've said about, foster care. It's not about me. It's about our next generation. How many of our next generation have been raised in foster care, don't know the language, don't know the ceremonies, don't know that side of the street? I'm fortunate. I learned both sides of the street. I've become educated. I've worked in the system. I've seen the good. I've seen the flaws of the system. I've fought for change in that system. But it's a continuous battle that we must never retreat from. We must take care of our children. So I hope this gives you a chance to think about what I've said. And this isn't going to be the end of it. I'm going to do another video very soon after I had, again, another chance to reflect on what I'm going to say, because I'm trying to approach this so that it reaches the programs, the social state programs, state care workers, social workers, therapists, whoever works with our Native children. So I hope I made sense. I really, really do, because I feel that this is a very important issue. As our tribes become stronger, we begin to redefine our culture, we begin to take back our language, teach our language, our ceremonies, teach our ceremonies to our children, involve them in the Native life. But we have a lot of children, adult children, that know very little about our culture. And sometimes this is the reason why. So until next time, thank you for this opportunity. And if I just ranted, I'm sorry. I'm going to try to be more organized. But for now, thank you.